Hello, this is Stephen Ujifusa. This is Wet Lunch from the High Seas. I'm here in Miami. I'm very honored to be the guest at a PEN America Authors Evening, and I'll be speaking about the last ships from Hamburg and about my work. And it's truly an honor to be recognized by this amazing organization that promotes the work of authors and of free speech around the country and around the world. And I've been thinking a lot about the role of money and art and expression these days, and looking at the current leadership uh, that we're seeing, the sort of trend towards greater concentration of wealth, and also I feel the Enlightenment ideal right now that was laid down in the 18th century by thinkers such as Locke and then solidified in the founding documents of the United States, the Constitution in particular, which was an exercise for the first time of the Enlightenment ideas of the free spirit of the individual, uh, are under attack, I think, from both sides right now. And I think this ideal was able to flourish from the 18th century into the late 20th century due to a rare combination of factors in human history. And I think now, given the current uncertainty in the world economically, socially, a lot of people are running towards two poles that are threatening the Enlightenment idea. The first is uh, divine right and monarchy. This was best personified by Louis XIV of France in the mid to late 17th century, who proclaimed L'État c'est moi, I am the state. It was he that revoked his grandfather's Edict of Nantes, which gave France's Protestants, and that was a huge portion of France's emerging middle and mercantile class. The revocation of Edict of Nantes basically banned Protestantism from France and forced many Huguenots, as they were known, to flee the country, either to Germany or to the United States. And Louis XIV waged many wars to expand France's power. He was very obsessed with the idea of glory. The Palace of Versailles was very much a personification of this idea of glory, of the Sun King, of the state and the people and the aristocracy revolving around the king. And this was something that was a very popular form of thought in the 17th century. England wrestled with it under the Stuarts. Charles I and other Stuart monarchs were very tempted by this idea of the divine right of kings. James II, the last of the Stuarts, was chased out of England in the 1680s for espousing this belief. It didn't help that he was a Catholic, and England had a long struggle for 200 years between Protestantism and Catholicism. And the solution was for England was the Via Media, the Anglican Church, that allowed, actually, I think, the idea of the British Enlightenment and also later of the Scottish Enlightenment to take hold, where you had thinkers like John Locke come up with these Enlightenment principles of primacy of the individual. That was something that was not acceptable in Louis XIV's France. The other pole is Marxism, and this began in the 1840s with Karl Marx's publication of the Communist Manifesto. And I believe that if you don't know Karl Marx, it's kind of like not knowing the Bible. If you want to understand Western thought, you have to know it. But I think that Marxism, unfortunately, in its purest form, has become another form of authoritarianism, where it's primacy of not of the monarch, but of abstract groups that war with each other. And there's no recognition of the primacy of the individual. Everyone's boiled down to groups. And I think Marx had a very kind of bleak understanding of human nature and this hope for a kind of salvation through a revolution and dictatorship of the proletariat. And this is very appealing in times of economic strife and uncertainty, industrialization. It makes total sense that this strain of thought came out in mid 19th century Europe. You had revolutions in 1848, around the same time that the Communist Manifesto was published. You also had industrialization, which was basically squeezing out the artisan class throughout Europe. And also this spread to America as well. And people were looking for some sort of solution. It was also an era when Christianity and religion were being questioned. And I think kind of like absolute monarchy under Louis XIV, the sense of certainty, l'état c'est moi, believe in the king. Karl Marx's doctrine offered a kind of salvation in a way. When the revolution comes could be subbed in for when Christ comes again or when the Messiah comes. I think it's a very strong urge in human nature to think this way when times are very uncertain. And we're seeing this now in the early 21st century of people looking for certainty in very uncertain times when it seems that the geopolitical globalist framework that had been in place since World War II is now falling apart in front of our own eyes. Globalization and offshoring led to the disintegration of many communities in the United States that, although not ideal, and we have to be very careful about idealizing the manufacturing economy. Before the New Deal, it was a very brutal and dangerous world for the typical worker. And we have to think, one election that sort of came to mind is the election of 1895 between Grover Cleveland and McKinley. No, it's probably my mistake. Between William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley, where there was a massive economic depression that began in 1893. And William Jennings Bryan was an interesting candidate. He was out of a Midwestern progressive tradition that had its roots in the farmers' granges, had some roots in Scandinavian and German communitarian socialist thought, and argued for a greater role in government, argued for the sort of deflation of American currency using silver. And then you had William McKinley, a Civil War veteran and a Republican business stalwart, who argued that wealth will trickle down from the wealthy and the business needs to continue. And obviously, the wealthy men of the United States, most notably J.P. Morgan, were very worried about their wealth being diluted by an influx of silver for use in the national currency. And oddly enough, McKinley won not just with the propertied upper middle and upper classes, but also with a lot of workers. And I think that if we want to sort of look for what happened in the last election, we need to look back at that election. Like, why didn't the working classes in America, regardless of ethnicity, swing heavily towards Trump? And I think in many ways it could be argued that it was kind of a McKinley-esque phenomenon. But at the same time, I think that we need to be careful right now when we're arguing back and forth in this polarized world, that we need to keep an eye on what the Enlightenment represented. Thinkers such as Adams, Jefferson, especially Franklin, who believed in science and believed in the rights of the individual. I mean, obviously, a lot of the slaveholding founding fathers were hypocritical in that, but they were people of their time. I think Adams and Franklin kind of represent the purest founding ideals of the United States, along with Washington. Washington, as many biographies, especially Ron Chernow's wonderful biography, depicted someone who started off as kind of a rather grabby, social climby, land-hungry planter who was very focused on building up his wealth and status as a young man. The revolution, I think, changed him. He actually was in the field with his troops. He experienced their suffering. He put his money where his mouth was. And by the time he left the presidency, he had been so worn down by partisan bickering and fighting that I think he realized that, okay, maybe I need to set an example by stepping away from power. And in spite of Washington's flaws, I think he was someone who changed. He was not an intellectual like Adams or Franklin. But he took the amazing step of setting the precedent of stepping away from power, which in a world that was governed by dynastic wars, Louis XIV's Europe and royal Europe was just basically defined by wars over which family got to rule. It was not a matter of merit or character, it was whose family would rule. Louis XIV fought several wars involving Austria and Spain to make sure that his descendants were put on the throne, and this had nothing to do with their merit. I don't think Louis XIV, he was a genius when it came to propaganda and power, but I don't think he or his descendants were particularly able. But most of European history had been defined by dynastic wars. Most of human history is defined by dynastic wars. George Washington stepped aside after 2 terms. And this is something that impressed Napoleon, who went down in flames fighting for basically a second chance as emperor, also impressed George III. So I think we need to keep these Enlightenment ideas in mind as they're under attack from absolutism, or could be called authoritarianism, and Marxism. I think that the founding fathers and the idea of the Enlightenment really was the people who found this country. They took it to heart. They were also, just to make sure that like the Enlightenment ran amok in France during the French Revolution, where it could have evolved into a constitutional monarchy like England. But I forgot who said it, this thing is when the terror began, when over 10,000 people were guillotined in France in the 1790s, the age of reason lost its nerve. This thinking that the mass terror and killing of thousands of people would change society. It was a kind of an early example, obviously an early example of the Russian Revolution. John Adams and Alexander Hamilton thought that the French Revolution was a very different beast than the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson relished it from afar. I think he loved the idea of revolution in the abstract. I don't think he particularly got that chopping off people's heads was a way to change human society by building temples to reason, because ultimately what France got was Napoleon. And it was a much longer, many decade march until the 1870s when France actually became a republic. It took another Napoleon, Napoleon III, his nephew, and a couple of other restored Bourbon kings to make that transformation happen. But I think that we need to keep these historical lessons in mind. We don't live in a time where people really think history matters that much. My thoughts are that whenever someone says we can surpass human history, we could surpass human nature, the end of history, watch out, because that's when you steer right in the iceberg. And I hope that we, as a country, really seriously study history, and before we point fingers or blame or scream, I think we need to look dispassionately at what history and human nature could take us. I think one of my biggest regrets as an historian was not being a double history and psychology major, because I think under that, if you understand psychology, you could understand a lot of history. Anyway, greetings from Florida. This is a special episode of Wet Lunch on the High Seas. Thank you so much for listening.